Good evening, and welcome to Scotland at 7 on this, the 13th of March. I'm Douglas MacKenzie, bringing you stories from Scotland and around the world. To look at the details behind those stories, I'm very pleased to be joined once again by William Duguid, writer, blogger, and still manning the barricades at the Perth Yes Hub, which I believe was a temporary thing, but it's still going on.
Well, we did have our roof blown off, so we've been fixing that. It wasn't our roof, it was the flats above, but we've had some fun with that and a gutter that was broken. So it's been a torrid time. That didn't mean say anything about barricades,
yes.
but there you are.
Yes, okay. Well, you can use the roof for that. There we are. So we start tonight because we're going into Ukraine in a bit more detail later with the Middle East update. And at least 48,524 Palestinians have been killed and 111,955 in Gaza since the 7th of October, according to the Gaza Health Authority. Israel's systemic attacks on women's healthcare in Gaza amount to genocidal acts. Israeli security forces have used sexual violence as a weapon of war to, quote, dominate and destroy the Palestinian people, a UN report states. The 49-page report on sexual and gender-based violence was drawn up by the UN's Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and presented to the UN Human Rights Council. It details attacks on maternity wards and other healthcare facilities for women, the destruction of an IVF clinic, and controls on the entry of food and medical supplies into Gaza that altogether, quote, destroyed in part the reproductive capacity of Palestinians in Gaza as a group. Israel's actions amounted to two categories of genocidal acts in the Rome Statute and the Genocide Convention, including deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of Palestinians and imposing measures intended to prevent births, the UN Human Rights Council said. A detained Columbia University graduate threatened with deportation after the Trump administration claimed he poses a risk to US foreign policy is a former employee of the British government who was extensively vetted before working at the embassy in Beirut. Mahmoud Khalil, a recent graduate from a Columbia University master's program, was arrested at home on the 9th of March as he returned with his wife from a dinner to break their fast during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. Khalil, a Palestinian born in Syria, had become a prominent face in protests on the Columbia campus over the last year. Following his arrest, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, accused him of leading activities aligned to Hamas, a designated terrorist organization. Negotiations to extend the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza were in limbo today, as the Trump administration shifted focus to talks with Russian officials in Moscow over the Ukraine war. Steve Witkoff, the Trump administration's Middle East envoy, was expected to leave negotiations in Qatar from Moscow to work on resolving both the Gaza and Ukraine conflicts. The ongoing talks in Doha have made little progress due to disagreements over the next steps, according to an Israeli official. Before I turn to William for his comments on it, let me just say to those of you watching live of the programme that you can message us on Blue Sky with your thoughts on the stories using the hashtag Scotland at 7. William, we have discussed events in Gaza for so long now, and very rarely do we have any progress to discuss, and it seems that that continues.
Yeah, progress is incredibly slow. And of course, as you've just said, the focus of the world is elsewhere at the minute, where we're now looking at what's going to happen in Ukraine. And there is always the possibility that things will be allowed to drag. This ceasefire that we have remains very fragile, with really both sides talking about what the other side is getting up to. And of course, while it's going on, We've got problems going on in the West Bank, where Israeli incursions are really looking to be the start of a long-term operation that might take up to a year, and that's quite frightening. Um, we've got connections through Commonweal Perth and Kinross with somebody in Jenin who came to visit us some years ago, and we've stayed in touch, and we're seeing videos of the tanks going through Burkeen and Jenin, and hearing about incursions into the hospital there, and it's just basically bullying. It seems that as soon as your attention is on one thing, something else will come along, and there'll be something going on there. The Middle East is still a powder keg, and it would be unfortunate, and to say the very least, if we couldn't make a wee bit more progress about solidifying the ceasefire, but also restraining the human rights abuses that are going on.
You say solidifying the ceasefire. Netanyahu, as we've discussed many times, has many reasons not to want a ceasefire, i.e. keeping himself in power because there's a war on. Trump is more interested in developing a resort, and Hamas no doubt would like peace, but they're also not committed to a two-state solution. So who is there who can possibly advance this?
I'm not sure there's anybody who can possibly advance this at the moment. I certainly don't think that the involvement of Donald Trump is necessarily going to be a good idea. But I suspect, we don't know, but I suspect that the Gazans would still want Hamas to be in control there, which is, if you like, a red line for the Israelis. And I don't think the diplomatic capability exists in the world right now that can sort out a conflict which really does go back well before 7th of October 2023. It goes back now 75 plus years. And how you heal yourself from that, I don't know. What I do know is that we cannot have a return to the violence that we have seen over the last 18 months, a horrific amount of carnage. And we certainly don't want things to be going on in the West Bank that are currently going on, because all that does is plant a seed of a desire for revenge, and it does not make for long-term stability and long-term peace. And that's what everybody really should be wanting. But how you get there, maybe we have to become a different species. I don't know.
I fear you're right. I hope that one day we will conclude the discussion on a hopeful note, but not for now. So we turn now to our update from Ukraine on day 1114 since Russia's full-scale invasion of the country. Vladimir Putin has visited Kursk for the first time since Ukraine partly invaded the Russian region in a surprise August 2024 offensive. The Russian president expressed hope his army was on the brink of, quote, fully liberating Kursk after it claimed to have retaken 24 settlements in the past 5 days. Minutes after Putin's remarks aired, Ukraine's army commander-in-chief, General Alexander Syrskyi, suggested his troops were pulling back to minimize losses. In the most difficult situation, my priority has been and remains saving the lives of Ukrainian soldiers. To this end, the units of the defence forces, if necessary, manoeuvre to more favourable positions, Syrskyi posted online, in terms typically used to describe a withdrawal. General Syrskyi said the Russian military was suffering huge personnel and equipment losses while trying to achieve political gains by attempting to oust Ukrainian troops. Sudza is the largest settlement that Ukraine seized in Kursk, and the Ukraine-based deep state open source mapping project showed earlier on Wednesday that Kyiv was no longer in full control of it. Volodymyr Zelensky said that Kyiv was doing as much as possible to protect its soldiers. The Russians are clearly trying to put maximum pressure on our troops, and our military command is doing what it has to do, the Ukrainian president told a press conference in Kyiv. We're preserving the lives of our soldiers as much as possible. Donald Trump suggested he could target Russia financially as Ukraine's president urged him to take strong steps if Moscow failed to support a 30-day ceasefire agreed between Ukrainian and US delegations meeting in Saudi Arabia. Washington, Kyiv, and Europe are waiting for Moscow's response to the proposal, and US envoys are expected to hold talks with Putin by the end of the week. The Kremlin has not publicly said whether or not it supports an immediate ceasefire. If Putin refuses, Trump said he could do things financially that would be very bad for Russia. President Zelensky said he expected strong measures from Washington if Russia rejected the ceasefire proposal. I understand that we can count on strong steps. I don't know the details yet, but we're talking about sanctions against Russia and strengthening Ukraine. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Washington wanted Moscow's agreement with no strings attached. That's what we want to know, if they're prepared to do it unconditionally, Rubio said on a plane heading to a G7 meeting in Canada. If the response is yes, then we know we've made real progress and there's a real chance of peace. If the response is no, it will be highly unfortunate and it will make their intentions clear. The US threats came as the French Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu told a press conference in Paris that a ceasefire announcement could come as soon as Thursday, and that Europe would have to be prepared to help enforce it. Defense ministers from Europe's 5 leading military powers, UK, Germany, Italy, Poland, and France, met in the French capital on Wednesday to discuss the formation of a reassurance force that would guarantee peace in Ukraine if a settlement was agreed. Lecornu said they were hoping to see a ceasefire tomorrow, and that 15 countries were willing to contribute to a force of up to 30,000 personnel that would permanently secure Ukraine's airports, ports, and infrastructure. Well, Moscow has not publicly responded according to that, but the indication was that Putin would accept a ceasefire with conditions, the condition being pretty much the total capitulation of Ukraine. So how seriously should we take Rubio's comment that he's waiting for unconditional acceptance? He's not going to get it, and Putin is too wily to reject it out of hand. So what do you think the likely scenario is? Of course, I'm asking you to predict the mind of Donald Trump, which, much as I respect your abilities, William, I suspect that's beyond you.
Yes, it certainly is. It's so hard to know where this is going at the minute. Putin is, I suspect, stalling right now while he gets Kursk fully back. Kyiv has lost control of it now. It was a bargaining counter. It would have been, I should say, a bargaining counter for Kyiv in any peace talks following a ceasefire. So clearly it's in Putin's interests to prolong things as long as he can till he gets Kursk fully back under control. I suspect that some of the actions of Donald Trump since that infamous exchange at the White House have not helped Ukraine in retaining the little bit of Kursk they had taken control of. And maybe that's something that we'll hear about later. But where we now go is interesting. I think Putin is going to be as maximalist as he possibly can in his demands. And I suspect, bearing in mind some of the things that Trump has already said, not that you can rely on them going far into the future, but I suspect that it's a bit of a charade saying, well, we can do things against Putin if he doesn't comply. It also sounds very gangsterish, which actually is fairly typical of the Trump administration thus far. I do also think that probably the long-term plan is for America and Russia to be involved in what happens to Ukraine and both to benefit from it. Putin will get to retain territory, America will get the mineral rights, and it will be a kind of carve-up. And I think that's been coming for a while. But that's a very cynical way of looking at it, but it just seems to be the way things are going. So I think my conclusion is that whatever happens, it's not going to be quite what Vladimir Zelensky wants, and it isn't necessarily going to lead to the long-term stability of Europe. We don't know what Putin's next move will be and when it will be, and I'm not sure that we're going to be quite ready enough for it.
No, we'll be coming to that later, certainly. But turning to the UK now, and Labour's management of the UK economy under Sir Keir Starmer is sparking growing disillusionment among voters, even in former strongholds like Merthyr Tydfil and Dudley. Many see the party as failing to deliver on promises. Recent focus groups conducted in Merthyr Tydfil and Dudley revealed widespread dissatisfaction with both the UK government and Labour. Voters expressed frustration with rising taxes and cuts to public services. While some blamed Labour's leadership under Starmer, others pointed to systemic issues in politics, including corruption and the prioritisation of big business over the public. The trust in politicians has eroded, with many feeling their promises go unmet, such as Labour's winter fuel payment cuts and unfulfilled pledges on immigration control. The focus groups also highlighted rising support for Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage. In both towns, there was a sense that Farage was tapping into widespread frustrations, particularly with Labour and the Conservatives. Many felt that Reform was voicing concerns that others ignored, like immigration and the power of large corporations. However, not all voters were convinced by Farage's leadership. Some questioned his ability to bring real change, with others wary of his links to controversial figures like Donald Trump. While Farage's appeal continues to grow in some areas, Reform faces significant challenges. Critics doubt the party can offer a genuine alternative to the political establishment without falling into populist traps. Meanwhile, Labour's attempts to shift rightward may ultimately validate far-right policies, as academic research suggests such strategies often enable rather than counteract the influence of populist parties. While Reform UK have increased their polling in Scotland, it has mostly been at the expense of the Conservative Party. Labour in Scotland are more vulnerable to the popularity of the left of centre policies of the SNP. Well, yes, we saw another Reform councillor in Scotland defect from another Conservative councillor in Scotland defect to Reform. What can we learn in Scotland from what's happening with Reform in England and Wales, do you think?
Well, I think we should be very mindful of people's current disgust for the existing political system and the seeming inability of that system to deliver positive change for them, which throws them into the arms of the populists. Simple as that. We need something different. This is something different. Let's have that. And if you like, we did our own straw poll at the Hub last Saturday when we held a stall in the High Street, and we did find, we would say, it's maybe not experimental evidence, but certainly evidence that there are quite a few people who are totally cheesed off with the whole gamut of politicians that we've got, and perhaps intending, even in Scotland, to vote for Reform. And it's not necessarily just going to be the Conservatives that suffer from this. And I think really the whole Yes movement has to be thinking in terms of we need to be putting up an alternative to Reform's alternative that actually gives some hope, or we may be in trouble. Whereas in England, they've got 4 years to work through this. We've got 13 and a half months. And I think there is considerable danger on the list in particular that Reform will get a reasonable enough percentage to be getting seats. And if they do, the insertion of an extra unionist party into the list means that there will be fewer seats for the pro-independence parties, because the percentages that used to get them seats will not necessarily get them seats. And that is a major concern. And the mainstream political parties all need to consider and deal with that. And how they do it, I don't know, because it does seem very difficult to get anything done under the existing political system. But they need to be producing benefits for people that seem to connect with their concerns. And I can't really put it any better than that, because reform will come along floating all sorts of things at them that they won't deliver either, but by the time they're in a position to be doing something about it, it'll be too late.
Indeed, a cautionary tale and a wake-up. Thank you, William. Now, inevitably, back to Donald Trump, who has threatened to impose a 200% tariff on wine, champagne, and other alcoholic products from European countries in response to EU tariffs on American bourbon whiskey. The EU's planned 50% levy on American bourbon whiskey, set to take effect on the 1st of April, follows Trump's introduction of a 25% tariff on steel and aluminium imports from the EU, which came into force on Wednesday. The escalating tariff disputes are part of a broader trade war that has raised concerns about the impact on global trade and the US economy. The EU's countermeasures are part of a €26 billion package aimed at retaliating against the US tariffs. Trump claims the tariffs will bring jobs back to the US, though most economists reject this idea. Critics argue that the trade war could damage the US economy with rising costs for businesses and consumers. Trump's decision to impose tariffs on the EU, Canada, Mexico, and China threatens to slow economic growth and could push the US into recession. The White House has downplayed investor concerns, with stock market declines erasing gains since Trump's election. Meanwhile, European trade officials have vowed to resist the US's demands. The European shares dropped, and concerns over the trade war negatively affected the stock prices of major European drinks companies. The US has also faced criticism for bypassing European product origin protections, with American imitations of wine and other products appearing in supermarkets. As the US economy faces increasing costs, the global trade environment remains uncertain, with both European and US leaders preparing for further retaliation. The escalating conflict has sparked fears of a wider economic slowdown. Well, we've seen the robust response of Canada to Trump's actions, and it looks like we're going to see something similar from the European Union. We're seeing something quite different from the UK, which has not made its mind up whether to take the European route or the US route, although it was interesting to hear a Labour politician in an interview note on two occasions that, well, we have to be a little more cautious because we don't have the strength that we did once we were in the time we were inside the European Union, which is quite an interesting Brexit comment. But what do you make of it all?
Some of it's saber rattling, but there is a huge risk now, I think, of a major slowdown worldwide that will do nobody any good. Trump seems to be quite insouciant about the possibility of a recession in the US. He thinks there might be a period of transition, but then everything will be fine because businesses will adapt in the US and sell more to US citizens at presumably prices they can afford. But in the sort of storm that the current trade-off of trading tariffs is creating, it's very, very difficult to see how businesses can prosper. And heavy stock market sell-offs are not helping in any way. And if you add that to the general insecurity that perhaps a lot of public employees feel in the US, I think the US is in big trouble on the path it's on, and there's no way the rest of the world escapes unscathed from that. So again, I wish I could be giving you all sorts of positive views about what's going to happen in the future, but this is not looking good. And all we can hope is, because I think it is the right thing to stand up to Trump, which the UK does not currently wish to do. But I think that's the only thing that gets him to back down and to claim, oh, it was only a tactic because I actually wanted something else, which you've now given me. Um, I don't see how kowtowing to him, as the UK seems to be doing at the moment, is going to have a good effect. And it certainly isn't going to help relations with the rest of Europe if we seem to be benefiting by being so supine as we seem to be. I don't think that's going to work in our long-term future anyway. It's a very uncertain situation and it has to be handled very carefully. I'm just not sure yet that anybody knows quite how to handle it because of the sheer unpredictability of Donald Trump and those who are now working with him. It's a long way from the 2016 to 2020 version where he had people around him who were able to counsel him against doing anything silly. He did a few silly things, but he wasn't going to wholesale do silly things. Now, he seems to have a free hand, and I think an increasing number of the American public don't like it, but certainly the rest of the world isn't liking it. And America's soft power has vanished. And that is a sea change for the world in its own right, irrespective of what happens to the economy. So, I can give you no other predictions, I'm afraid.
Well, no, I didn't expect any. And but it is strange, isn't it, that trade is something which would normally be discussed in the Congress and debated at great length, and Trump has taken to himself the power to make decisions unilaterally. Yet Congress has been as supine as the United Kingdom in standing up to him.
I think, well, with Republican majorities, I think they still welcome it. It's yet really to hit them how much trouble they might be in. And it might be interesting when they do realise it. And also when the resistance that is, I think, growing in America to all the things that are going on with the Trump administration, when they really sort of hit fever pitch. And that may be coming as the spring arrives. Look out.
Yeah, it does seem so. I mean, economists seem to be broadly critical of Trump's measures on this, and he's the only one who seems to think that there will be great times ahead. He hasn't used the phrase sunny uplands, but it does sound very similar in his tone to Brexit predictions, and we'll see if it turns out the same way for the United States. In England now, and Keir Starmer has announced plans to abolish NHS England, a body set up during the Conservative health reforms to bring the health service back under direct political oversight and cut bureaucracy. The decision follows a long-standing criticism of the 2012 NHS overhaul led by former Health Secretary Andrew Lansley, which created NHS England. Starmer and Health Secretary Wes Streeting argued that the move would streamline the health service, reduce costs, and shift resources towards frontline services such as doctors and nurses. This restructuring is expected to help tackle long waiting times ahead of the next general election. Under the proposal, NHS England will be dissolved and its responsibilities will be returned to central government. Streeting, who has already overseen efforts to reduce NHS England's size, claimed the change marked the final nail in the coffin of the 2012 reorganisation. The Chief Executive of NHS England, Amanda Pritchard, is set to leave her post at the end of the month. While the Labour UK government aims to reduce inefficiencies, some trade unions are concerned that the cuts and reorganisations could lower staff morale. However, Starmer denied it was a return to austerity, asserting that the changes were necessary to prevent further damage to public services caused by past policies. The Liberal Democrats supported the move, but urged greater focus on reforming social care. Some former health officials expressed scepticism, suggesting that the promised savings and efficiencies might not materialise, warning that the focus should remain on patient care rather than structural changes. As the government moves forward with this plan, further debate when any potential new legislation is expected. Well, of course, this is not Scotland, this is England, and we'll be talking about some of the things that the Scottish Government are doing to try and improve healthcare in Scotland later. But it is striking, going all the way back to Margaret Thatcher and the setting up of health boards, that whenever there's a perceived crisis in healthcare in England, the strategy is to restructure rather than worry about frontline care. It's all about administration rather than doctors.
Yes, and in the end, it's going to be about money, because I suspect the one thing the NHS needs, both in England and in Scotland, and of course in Scotland it will be affected in Barnett consequential terms by what happens in England, it's a question of funding it sufficiently to keep it running, but in this case now to overcome the queuing, etc., that has really mostly been created since COVID, although there was some in the system beforehand. It's going to need a lot of money poured into it, and I suspect that there might be some money wasted in the process of restructuring. That's one of the issues with restructuring, and one of the reasons why restructuring doesn't always create the benefits that you think it's going to do, because it's actually a more expensive process than you expect it to be. And there is also the problem of morale, particularly in the public sphere, when you're hearing about cuts elsewhere and you're worrying about cuts that might affect you. The question also is, how much of this is going to be public money and how much is still going to be private money? And that we don't know. And that's what the big mystery is in terms of how it will ultimately affect NHS Scotland, which itself could do with a decent influx of money. And as we'll discuss later, I think it's doing a lot of things which make it efficient because it has to be, because it has been starved of money just because the English system has been starved of money. It's an incredible way to be doing things. I would much rather that in Scotland we were raising all our own money and looking after our public finances for ourselves, rather than being on the end of this constant chain where big things happen in England and we're thinking, now what? What happens to us here? But here we are, and we'll see if the government can, the UK government can actually deliver over the next little while the changes it's looking to deliver without basically making a mess of it, because much of what they've done in their first few months they have made a mess of, and they've created problems for themselves as a result. And the various financial demands, defence not least, are stacking up, and Rachel Reeves appears not to be wanting to really open the purse too much more than she already is. The fiscal rules rule. And so this is another uncertain situation, and I'm not sure that the UK government is quite ready for a big reformation right now.
No, and when they take it in conjunction with the so-called Project Chainsaw, I can be sure that, almost sure that less public money will go into it, which, as you say, has a worrying effect in Barnett consequentials for Scottish funding in the health service. A report from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, NIESR, reveals that the UK's position as an affluent nation has been severely impacted by nearly a decade of welfare cuts and stagnant incomes. The study highlights that the poorest districts in the UK now rank lower than even the lowest income areas of Malta and Slovenia. Districts in Birmingham were identified as the most deprived, with living standards in the West Midlands falling behind those of parts of Slovenia. Between 2020 and 2023, the poorest 10% in the region saw their living standards decline due to a combination of welfare cuts and minimal real income growth. The report stresses that UK regional income growth has been among the slowest in Europe, with many European nations experiencing faster income growth. This report serves as a warning ahead of the spring statement on 26th of March, where Labour's Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is expected to propose further welfare cuts to meet spending rules outlined in last year's budget. Despite increasing government borrowing costs, there are no plans to raise taxes or borrowing limits. The report also points to weak productivity growth as a major contributor to the stagnation in real wages. UK workers are about 20% less productive than their French and German counterparts, and 30% less than US workers. The UK now ranks low in terms of welfare generosity within the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, with welfare payments covering the cost of essentials in only 2 of the past 14 years. The report concludes that the UK's approach has left millions trapped between low wages and inadequate welfare support, threatening its future economic prosperity. When I read this, William, my blood boiled a little bit. It just dripped with metropolitan London condescension, saying, "Oh, we're even worse than Malta and Slovenia," as if they were the slums of Europe, whereas they are small independent countries with growing economies, and the UK is not. What was your interpretation of it?
Well, I was reminded of some of the things that were said to Malta when they wanted to break away from the UK, very similar to what was said about Scotland a wee bit later. And Malta's doing, just fine. It's, as you say, a small European country, and of far greater concern is the clear vicious circle that the UK economy seems to be in. What creates productivity? It's not necessarily workers stopping being lazy all of a sudden. It's investment. And the money just isn't circulating in the UK economy, or at least the people who've got the money aren't willing to invest it properly in raising that productivity. And so you've got a situation where you're neither getting prosperity through the sort of wages that people want to be earning in order to meet essentials, nor are you getting any security from the welfare system. More cuts in prospect. How is that going to do anything other than drag us through another cycle of this vicious circle? So it's another litany of despair, I'm afraid. And at some stage, you would hope that the UK government would look at two things. One is actually do raise taxes on those who can afford to pay them. That's the first thing. And the other thing is just to think in terms of the fiscal rules and perhaps stretching them a little bit, as Germany is doing to pay for defence, and we may hear some of that a wee bit later. But certainly don't be hamstrung by them, because that's exactly what's happening. And you're making things worse by adhering to the rules than by flexing them. And other countries seem to manage this. Many economists seem to think the fiscal rules are daft. Perhaps not enough of them, unfortunately, but nevertheless, I think if one of those two things doesn't happen, the cycle of despair continues.
Yes, thank you. Staying with reports on the UK, and a new report from the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission has warned that the UK's long-term food security is at risk due to a dysfunctional food economy failing both farmers and the public. The Paying the Price report highlights the consequences of decades of prioritising low-cost calories, which has led to unhealthy food becoming more widespread while putting immense pressure on farmers. Real farming incomes have stagnated for 50 years, with the rise of ultra-processed food and cheap imports eroding the value of UK-produced products like wheat, milk and meat. This has resulted in a concentration of power within a few large businesses, particularly supermarkets and agricultural corporations, which dominate the UK food chain. These large entities have contributed to a system where farmers are left with little control over pricing or policy decisions. The UK government has allowed this concentration of power to continue, leaving farmers vulnerable as small-scale operations disappear and rural communities shrink. In addition, the country's self-sufficiency in key foods like fruit and vegetables has declined, and the environmental costs of food production, such as soil degradation and water pollution, continue to rise. Despite these issues, UK households continue to spend a relatively small proportion of their income on food, which has benefited large supermarket chains but comes at a heavy cost to public health and nature. The report calls for a fundamental shift in policy to ensure that growing and selling healthy, sustainably grown food is properly rewarded. It suggests measures such as higher trade standards, investment in priority sectors like fruit and vegetables, and the creation of a food market regulator to better balance the interests of the public, farmers, and businesses. The Commission stresses the need for a more ambitious and fair food system to strengthen the UK's long-term food security. Well, to stay with a food metaphor, this sounds to me like pie in the sky. Um, yes, it stresses that in the UK, households spend a very low proportion of their income on food. And this has always been the case. I remember Tesco trying to promote free range chicken, but no, people wouldn't buy it. They wanted the cheapest. I remember speaking to a Dutch farmer before Brexit who was saying, "Oh, yeah, I'm not worried. We have tomatoes which we can't sell anywhere else in Europe. Britain will still keep buying them." It does seem to be all about price, and it's going to be more than policy which changes people's attitudes to that, is it not?
I think so. Why do you think people are just wanting to pay the lowest price they possibly can for food? Could it be that they don't feel they have enough money? And this links to other stories we've had tonight. Um, Also, I think there's a fundamental imbalance in the UK economy in that the cost of the roof over your head, whether you rent or whether you've purchased, is far too high, and the cost of food is far too low. And if you were to rebalance those, and for people it could be um, uh, revenue neutral or whatever term you want to choose, that might help, because we certainly need to do more to promote decent food. That's for sure. We need to do more to break up the consolidation of the supply chains, which is effectively going to threaten our food resilience going forward. But we just need to have a more well-being sort of economy where people do have enough money to afford the essentials. And uh, we're a long, long way from that. And I don't see any joined up thinking that's going to lead to very great changes here. In fact, if anything, and here we are talking earlier about trade, what deal are we going to end up doing with the US to stay friendly with them, if that's what we want to do, if we want to remain supine? And what's that going to mean in terms of our food standards? Is it the famous chlorinated chicken? Is it something else that's not good for us? Um, it really is a mess, and we need to sort it out, and we need to have a fundamentally different attitude to how we treat people within the economy. And I don't have a solution to this, because it's like you have the tangled mess and you say, well, I wouldn't have started from here. But here we are.
Yes.
And somebody needs to be the visionary here. And however long it takes, sort things out.
Yeah, I think it's going to take more than a couple of policy changes to sort it out, as you say. Germany now, and Germany's Chancellor in waiting, Friedrich Merz, is negotiating with the Greens, excuse me, to secure support for proposed fiscal rule changes aimed at increasing defence spending ahead of crucial parliamentary decisions. Merz, leader of the conservative CDU-CSU alliance, is seeking to establish a €500 billion fund for infrastructure investment and overhaul. Germany's borrowing limits to boost military spending. With the new parliament set to convene in less than 2 weeks, Merz aims to secure a deal before potential opposition from far-right and far-left MPs who could form a blocking minority. As Germany faces growing pressure to relax its strict fiscal rules, known as the debt brake, the proposal has been welcomed by Merz's allies and markets, with economic forecasters predicting the public spending boost could help Germany recover from recent economic stagnation. However, the deal is still pending, as Merz must win support from the Greens to secure the two-thirds majority required to amend the constitution. In his discussions with the Greens, Merz has proposed expanding defence spending to include civil defence and intelligence, emphasising the urgency of improving Germany's defensive capabilities in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Despite this, the Greens have raised concerns, citing the lack of focus on climate policies and other issues in the proposed legislation. Merz's plans have faced criticism from both the far-right Alternative für Deutschland and the far-left Die Linke, who have filed complaints with the Constitutional Court, which could rule this week. Merz has framed the increase in defence spending as essential for both Germany and Europe's security, particularly in the context of Russia's actions and Europe's need for greater independence, especially with Donald Trump's tenure in the White House. The second and third readings of the proposals are set for next Tuesday, with continued negotiations expected. I don't know how closely you follow German politics, William, but it seems that the only thing lacking for the Greens is the word additional. That the Greens have always opposed the debt brake in Germany, but they were made an offer today that 500 billion would be pushed towards technology transition to a green economy, and they're saying no, we don't want things just moved from one pot to the other. We want additional funding for it. So that seems to be the stumbling block, but it's pretty important for Europe as a whole. This defence spending, is it not?
I think it is, and I've held Germany up as the model of when to flex the fiscal rules, but of course it's not as easy as one might hope, because it does require a bit of horse trading. I think, not to stretch too much of a point, there must be some deal they can come up with that involves extra funds towards climate protection, because that's a form of defence. This is probably me being some sort of weird lawyer figure here, thinking up strange stories. I think they will manage this. I do, because in Europe, they're used to doing deals, because we have coalitions all over the place. In Scotland, I wish we were a bit better at doing deals. And of course, horse trading with Greens is something that's been in our recent past and hasn't necessarily worked out for us. But I think they will probably come up with something, and it will involve more money going into climate protection. At the minute, I think the Greens have been complaining about things like the fact that Merz left a voicemail message for their parliamentary leader, and that was bad manners. And that's usually a prelude. It's a telling off that's a prelude to maybe a deal getting done in the end. I have more faith in the Germans to do a deal amongst themselves than I actually have with Donald Trump to do one of his fabled deals. That's not saying much, perhaps, but nevertheless. Here's one where I'm actually fairly optimistic, strangely enough.
Oh, we should have a little bell to ring on the program when that happens. But yes, I mean the thought of not releasing the debt brake must be anathema to the Greens. So I think they will find. I was struck very much by a quotation from Katharina Droger, who is the Greens parliamentary group leader, who said that she needed the word additional. Otherwise, the CDU and the SPD are just going to use the money to fulfill election pledges that they made. Now, they obviously do things differently in Germany, where they consider fulfilling election pledges is quite important. It might be something for Westminster to take heed of in that.
Highly original thought.
Yes,
I agree.
Well, we looked at the proposed changes to health in England earlier, and the Scottish Government Cabinet Secretary for Health, Neil Gray, has announced a £6 million investment in the Accelerated National Innovations Adoption ANIA programme to support people with type 2 diabetes, stroke patients, and newborns with a rare genetic condition. The funding will back several health initiatives, including a national digital weight management programme for 3,000 people recently diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. With £4.5 million allocated over 3 years, The programme aims to help around 40% of participants achieve remission within their first year. 2 additional projects will focus on pharmacogenetics, exploring how genetic variations influence responses to medications. £1.1 million will fund research into stroke patients to identify a genetic variation, how it reduces the effectiveness of a drug used to prevent secondary strokes. If the variation is present, alternative medications may be recommended. A further £800,000 will support a programme providing genetic testing for newborns to identify those at risk of permanent hearing loss due to a reaction to a common emergency antibiotic. The Scottish Government says these initiatives reflect its commitment to harnessing digital and scientific innovations to improve health outcomes. The funding is part of the Scottish Government's broader efforts to reform health services and reduce pressures on the NHS in Scotland, and at the same time deliver life-changing benefits for individuals, improving both their health and the quality of life. So not huge amounts of money being spent there, but all things, William, which could have a huge health and financial benefit in preventing future complications from these illnesses.
Yes, the diabetes one is an interesting one because it's been increasingly recognised in recent years that particularly shortly after diagnosis, it is possible to reverse the initial effects of diabetes through a bit more attention to diet than patients maybe traditionally have always exercised. But it's a goal that can be achieved, and it's a sensible thing to do it because that cuts down the costs that you'll incur later on if you don't manage to reverse them. I'm particularly interested, though, by the genetic variations being picked up in the 2 other ones, because that actually helps you to assess how precisely the medication that you do prescribe for the conditions is going to is likely to work. It's a form of precision medicine. I think the phrase was used somewhere in the Scottish Government output, and that's just the sort of thing that the Scottish NHS needs to be doing, because that is in itself an efficient thing to be doing. And the one thing the NHS has to be is efficient. It doesn't have money to kick around the place, and therefore, if it can do things better and not waste money on drugs that aren't going to work because you've determined that they're not going to work and therefore you need to prescribe something else, that is a clear good thing. So I applaud this, and hopefully if it does save money, then they'll be able to put more money into more of this and maybe increase the number of patients that can be benefited. So it's another good news story. I'm pleased to have 2 in a row. Ring the bell twice.
We're on a roll. Well, let's see if we can get the hat trick now. The Scottish Government has introduced amendments to the Housing Scotland Bill, aiming to strengthen efforts to prevent homelessness by involving a wider range of services and support mechanisms. The amendments focus on enhancing the bill's existing provisions, which place a stronger emphasis on preventing homelessness through ask and act duties for social landlords and organisations such as health boards, Police Scotland and the Scottish Prison Service. These bodies will be required to identify housing issues early and act to prevent individuals from becoming homeless. Developed with input from homelessness charities like Crisis, the changes aim to ensure individuals receive timely assistance. The amendments will mandate increased cooperation between services with a clearer framework on the support required to help people remain in their homes. The Government is also introducing £4 million in pilot programmes for 2025 to 26 to test these measures. Housing Minister Paul McLennan MSP stated that the Scottish Government's goal is to make Scotland a global leader in homelessness prevention, building on its already robust homelessness rights. The proposed amendments are designed to provide earlier intervention, preventing individuals from reaching a housing crisis. The changes align with the government's broader priority of tackling child poverty with a clear focus on providing stable housing for all. If approved by the Scottish Parliament, these amendments will reinforce the collective responsibility of society in addressing homelessness, offering long-term positive outcomes for affected households. This seems a little bit like the health story in that it's spend some money now and you'll reap the benefits later on, because once people are homeless, then getting them back into proper accommodation is considerably more expensive.
Yeah, this looks good. It's a great goal to want to be a world leader in homelessness prevention, and currently we have amongst, I think, the strongest rights in the world. But no point in having rights if they can't be exercised, if you can't actually access the help. So this looks to be building the help into the arrangement, funding it, and also making sure that people are helped before they're at the point of crisis. And that's very important. And as you say, it ties in with the goal of ending child poverty, because a safe, stable home is one of the key things that you need in order to not have children in poverty. And I liked the idea of collective responsibility. I think that's good too. We shouldn't see homelessness as something for other people. It's there, but for the grace of God go I. And therefore, collective responsibility is a good thing. So, yeah, I will applaud this, and you don't need to ring the bell again. But yeah, it's a good move, I think.
Well, that would be the hat trick, and we finish on a football story. The Scottish Government has introduced new legislation to help secure Scotland's role as a host for the UEFA Euro 2028 Championships, including measures to combat ticket touting and regulate event zones. The UEFA European Championship Scotland Bill, introduced to the Scottish Parliament, aims to tackle the resale of tickets for profit and regulate street trading and advertising in designated event zones in Glasgow. If passed, the legislation will allow Scottish courts to impose fines up to £20,000 with unlimited penalties for severe offences. The tournament, scheduled for June and July 2028, will feature 24 national teams, with matches taking place across the UK and Ireland, including at Hampden Park in Glasgow. Business Minister Richard Lochhead emphasised the significance of hosting the event for Scotland's global reputation, noting it will enhance the country's legacy of hosting major sporting and cultural events. The bill's provisions aim to protect UEFA's commercial rights and prevent the exploitation of fans through ticket touting, ensuring that the event runs smoothly. Public consultation for the bill took place between May and July 2024, engaging street traders, media owners, local businesses, and residents, with findings published in October 2024. The bill proposes event zones in Glasgow, with further consultations planned for Hampden and other locations. I suppose, William, that's a good news story, but having suffered in-person Scottish failures in Mexico, in Spain, and in Rome, it just seemed it was a bit more cheerful to be there and see Scotland lose in the sunshine with some beers afterwards than on a rainy night in Glasgow.
Well, it might not rain, and they might be really nice fan zones. I'm sure that the authorities will have learned from Euro 2020, which was actually played in 2021. And of course, I'm sure we have an exciting new crop of players who will all get themselves totally energised and ready to create their own party atmosphere and their own sunshine if there isn't any sunshine. I'm now getting hopelessly carried away now, and just as well it's the end of the show, because I'll be floating up to the ceiling next.
Yeah, we have Steve Clark on the phone. He'd like a word before you go. This new crop of players. Well, that's it for this evening, Scotland at 7. Thank you very much to our guest tonight, William Duguid. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We were £16,000 short of our funding requirements in 2024, which has left us short of the money we need to pay our bills. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around £2,500. We urgently need to raise at least £8,000 to pay our bills now. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you again to our guest, William Duguid, for his insight tonight. But for me, Douglas MacKenzie, goodbye and good night.